Good afternoon, Rochester. Welcome to the Equity Series. My name is Wafa Al Khalifa, and I work for Destination Medical Center as the Equitable Development Coordinator. I am here with my colleague, Chow Matala, and she serves the city of Rochester as the Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Director. We welcome you to the March episode of the Equity Alliance Equity Series. And we're so pleased that you're able to join us during this lunch hour. I want to remind everyone that we are building a library full of amazing topics, different episodes that we've been sharing with you all. I thinking we are in number 21, maybe, or 20th episode so far. So if you want to ever access all these episodes, you'll find them in the Destination Medical Center YouTube channel. I've heard some people use them as a professional development tool that it's shared with their colleagues and in their network as a way to learn some new and some best practices in the diversity, equity, and inclusion space. I also want to remind everyone that if your organization is interested to learn more about the Equity Alliance, or if you're interested in joining the Equity Alliance, feel free to contact me or my colleague Chow Matala, and we'll be more than happy to meet with your organization or share a presentation at your organization with some of the things that Destination Medical Center and the City of Rochester have been committing to so far since we formed the Equity Alliance, and what are some of the things that we have done internally in order to improve our organizations to become more equitable, more diverse, and more inclusive. But now I don't want to keep talking and keep you waiting for today's episode and for today's topic. Um, as some of you have attended the February episode where Chow and I presented some information about how can we create safe safe spaces at our workplaces with the current political landscape, and we shared so many resources and tools and ideas on how can we keep our employees safe and how can we create spaces for them. We touched on that there is the need to assess things also within your organization legally. And this is why we are having this episode today, where you will hear from our presenter, Karen McLaughlin. She's attorney at law, and she's been practicing law in the Rochester area for over 26 years. She is also director at the Rochester Public School Board. Where she will touch on the family unit and the diversity, equity, and inclusion and accessibility in our current climate. How can we be more supportive to our employees? How can we create a deeper understanding of the legal landscape around DEI? And how can we support our employees and their families and migrant families? And how can your organization create best practices and strategies to support your migrant employees in during uncertain times? So I would like to welcome Karen McLaughlin to our March episode. And thank you so much for being with us today. And we look forward to your presentation. And I want to invite everyone to utilize the chat to plug in their questions, comments. And if you prefer to send questions and comments directly to Chow, Chow will be monitoring the chat and will read your questions later. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for inviting me to this presentation. I am going to get my slides ready to go here for you. There we go. And I didn't follow Chow's advice to go back to the beginning, so give me a second here.
It's
Thought
fine.
I thought I did it. Hold on. I did it in one place, but not the other, so that's where we're at. Let's do it this
No
way.
problem.
And let's see if this works for us.
From the beginning, if you click
That's
on from.
Yep, I think that's what I did, and it's
Awesome.
not. Let me try this. We're going to do this. Here we go.
Sure. And everyone, feel free to share your name and the organization you're associated with in the chat. Also, I want to invite everyone, and I'm looking at you, Amanda, if you have any upcoming events or resources that you would like to share with the community, feel free to share that in the chat as we're building this community of leaders, DI practitioners through the equity series.
All right.
There we
Can
go.
everyone see my slide with my picture here?
Yes.
Wonderful.
Perfect.
Sorry about that. I'm always having those tech difficulties. But again, thank you all for inviting me today. I'm really excited to talk about this project. As Wafa introduced myself, I do want to start off with a little bit of a disclaimer because I am an attorney, that the things that I'm talking about here today, if you know me either through my community work or my legal practice, what I'm talking about today is completely separate from those organizations that I work with. So these are my own thoughts and my own suggestions for how to create a safe space at work, separate from those different either employment or elected office that I hold. And just to give a little bit more background, I do practice in the area of family law in Rochester, which is where the idea of family unity comes from. And what I want to share about that is a lot of times in family law, we're talking about people either divorcing or having custody battles. And that's a lot of my day-to-day work. But there are also opportunities for the work of family law practitioners to work in the space of keeping families together and helping them through perhaps some challenging times, like Wafa mentioned, migrant employees or other situations that people are in. And that is part of our family law practice as well. And then, so I see this presentation today, a little bit about that family unity, and then also some recommendations and guidelines that I've learned about in the DEI space to respond to what is a very challenging current climate. One of the things that I've learned about DEIA is that I like to say those words out loud because I think it gives a different perspective. It's not just an acronym. It's about diversity, it's about equity, it's about inclusion, and it's about accessibility. And I think each one of those words is important to our community and to the legal landscape that we're looking at. So the agenda for today is to, again, take a little bit of introduction to that topic of family unity, why it's important to maintain that unity. What are we looking at in our current climate and how can we help people? And specifically, how can your organization continue to support employees? And then finally, the bigger part of the presentation is more about understanding the legal landscape of this diversity, equity, inclusion, accessibility work and ways that you can help. So where I come from in terms of family unity is that I also used to serve on the Human Rights Council here in Olmsted County, and that helped me inform a lot of my thinking in this space. And it's really about prioritizing human decency, human rights, and human relationships to keep families together. And that applies to anyone in our community. It might be migrant employees, it might be someone who needs to go to either mental health or chemical dependency treatment temporarily and needs help to maintain their family at home while they're going to do those things. Or if someone's traveling outside the country for a period of time, they may need some documents that are of assistance so that they can, if they have children, they can be confident that their children still here in Rochester have the services that they need. And I think it's really just one of the things that I think about is Rochester is a very unique community that I think leans to some of these topics being important here. The one thing that is critical, both from the legal perspective and in my personal approach to things, is it's so important for people to know their constitutional rights and that everyone should know their rights. That just standing on the soil in the United States of America provides you with constitutional rights that are protected, and that's important to keep in mind. In terms of the things that can help with this family unity, is there are documents that are available. They're pretty self-service that people can create these with a little bit of help, and I'll give a resource here at the end of the slide. But a delegation of parental authority is something that someone would sign if they're facing a situation where they may need to be separated from their children. And the delegation of parental authority delegates or gives that authority to help with the children, whether it be education and getting them enrolled in school or getting medical care, getting public benefits. A parent can delegate those things to another trusted person, but it's something they need to do in advance so that they can plan for that in case there is some sort of crisis situation. There is also something known as a power of attorney, and this is more related not to the children, but to things like either financial assets or bank accounts, retirement accounts, all those kinds of things that you might need someone to act in your behalf in order to protect those things for you and your family. It's also important to make sure that people have passports and that passports are updated and renewed so that if someone needs those important identification documents that they're available. And then finally, copies of any important documents like immigration papers or court documents. Important to keep copy of those in a safe place so that you know where to access them if you need to do that in an emergency. And overall, really just thinking about safety and safety planning for yourself, your family, the people you care about. That I take the view that if you can do that safety planning up front and really think about those issues, and everyone's situation is different. So your friend or your neighbor might have a different situation than your family. And you really need to kind of think through those things, again, knowing your rights and then having these documents prepared if you need them, so that if you need to act in a crisis, you have those tools available to you to keep your family together. And this is the resource I was talking about. It's lawhelpmn.org. It is a great resource for looking at information about these documents to determine if you need them or not, and then also some fact sheets with more detail, and even the forms that you need are all linked through that resource. It's something that was really beefed up during the pandemic so that people can be a self-help website that can help you through a lot of these things, that you don't need an attorney necessarily if you can follow those fact sheets and it's not that complicated. The delegation of parental authority does need to be notarized by a notary, but those are available at banks and other people in the community. And one of the new things is that finally, the lawhelpmn.org delegation of parental authority has now been translated, at least into Spanish. I haven't looked into other languages, but it may be available in some other languages as well. Both the fact sheets and the form itself. The form is in English, but there are kind of like subheadings in Spanish to indicate what goes in what parts of the form. And that's a fairly new development that we finally have that in place. So that's really helpful to our communities. And then talking a little bit more about why this family unity is important. Again, it's protecting those constitutional rights for everyone that has them. It's really important when families in our community may have blended immigration status, that if one parent is documented, the other is not. Some children may be documented, some may not, some may be citizens. It gets really complicated really fast, and documents like this can help protect not only the constitutional rights, but keeping the families together, or if there needs to be safety planning and emergency planning, it's done in a planful way rather than in a crisis. It'll be a crisis, but at least this is a way to navigate through as best you can. And again, as I mentioned earlier, I think Rochester is really unique in a lot of ways in that the our diverse population makes this situation quite complicated. I know that there's kids in our schools that are worried about this. I know that there's all kinds of employees that are worried about this. And that's why one of the reasons I wanted to present today is to provide these tools, because I do think that Rochester, it just has a really unique perspective on this issue. I also think it's really important to celebrate that diversity in our community rather than being critical of it or ignoring it. And in my view, from all the different hats that I wear, the really important piece is keeping our communities safe. And that's my primary goal of being here today. So as Wafa talked about, we did have a session in February about our current climate. And what I'm here today to do is to talk a little bit more about what we can do to respond to the current climate. But I want to start off with a little bit of an interaction and engagement here with a word cloud. So if you would be willing to share your thoughts on the following question: how are you feeling about our current climate? And there's a QR code or a website you can go on with the ID number.
And for those who are unable to access it, feel free to send me or Chow directly in the chat, and we can plug in your your feeling into this. Yep.
And I'm going to give it a few seconds here. It looks like people are typing in. This is good. And I'm going to start reading off some of these because we're getting quite a few. Different words: resigned, targeted, defeated, anxious. Anxious is a big one. It looks like worried, frustrated. I get that. Terrified, yes. Uncertain, yes. Excluded, yes. Apprehensive, yes. Scared, yes. All of those things. Oh, I like that one. Determined. Yes. We need to focus on that. Thank you all for participating in that. I really appreciate it. It's good to put that that community perspective to this topic, because it is such a challenging climate, and we all need to work together to work through how we're feeling about it. Unprecedented. Yes, I agree. Okay. Looks like one more person is adding. All right, and I think I can leave that open while I go on here. So the question becomes, how can your organization support its employees? That one of the big parts here is understanding the legal landscape of this topic. That one of the things that I see in the media about this issue recently is that diversity, equity, inclusion, and accessibility is somehow a divisive issue. And I'm here to say today that it's not. It's not a divisive issue, and that's why I want people to better understand the legal landscape. But it is important to have open and frank dialogue and feedback about this issue in your organizations, that people may be hearing things like initiatives like this, and what Chow and Wafa are doing every day is somehow divisive, or we need to pull back from those initiatives. And I think it's important to talk about those things in your organizations. You may not all agree, and it's a very challenging time to work through these issues. But again, I think that open dialogue and feedback is critical to everyone being heard. And highlighting personal responsibility. I think that's more about taking ownership of the things that you think, and it kind of goes back to being open and frank with each other, but also um, if someone is doing something that you don't see as right, to take personal responsibility and consider them calling them out on that if you're able to. This next bullet point, integrating DEIA into core values and practices. This is one of my other reasons for wanting to do this presentation, is this is a huge piece of this work. It's not enough to just talk about these concepts, but integrating them into your mission statement, your values, your policies is so critical. In amongst your employees, fostering mentorship and career development. I think that's a way to highlight the great things about your organization and the diversity of your organization. And then finally, I hadn't even thought about this until I found this resource, but investing in mental health and well-being is such an important piece of this, because it is hard work. It is difficult. And they're difficult conversations to have, even with people you know well, or people you generally agree with might not have the same views on this topic. And that's why it's important to invest in that mental health and well-being for everyone, so that everyone can feel safe and heard in their work environment. So again, understanding the legal landscape is the key part of what we're going to talk about next. I did also want to share that, like I said before, family law is my practice area, so that family unity is more something I'm used to talking about. This understanding the legal landscape in DEIA is not. I'm not an expert in this area, but it was important to me to start this conversation with you all and be here today. So if you have questions at the end, I may or may not be able to answer them. I might need to send you to another resource. If you have concerns about what I'm saying, definitely share them. That's what we're here about. So in terms of understanding the legal landscape, it's important to review the legal implications, but I would suggest it's also important not to go overboard and be overly cautious. And I'll talk about why in a second here. You also want to consult with your legal teams, depending on the size of your organization, that they may have input into your thinking and your planning and your policies. And it's also important to ensure that your DEIA efforts align with legislation and state laws. And that's part of what I'm going to talk about here today too. So in preparing for this presentation, right before I met with Chow and Wafa, I found this great resource. It was just issued on February 13th, 2025. It's a multi-state guidance concerning diversity, equity, inclusion, and accessibility in employment initiatives. It was issued on February 13th by 16 attorney generals across the country, and very much a shout out to our Attorney General Keith Ellison, that Minnesota is part of this. I provided a copy here on the screen to show you what it looks like. There's a QR code so you can access it. There's a link so you can access it. I have one as a prop here. It is a treasure trove of information that when I read it, I was just shocked at how it's positive in the context of what a challenging environment this is right now, that this is positive feedback about why we need to continue these initiatives. And when I saw it, I was like, this is exactly what we need to talk about in March. So let's talk about it a little bit more. It talks about the benefits of DEIA initiatives and practices. It talks about the benefits of those practices and that they reduce biases. They boost workplace morale, they foster collaboration, and they create opportunities for all the employees. And contrary to what a lot of people think or believe, there's research to show in this document that organizations that prioritize these equitable practices outperform other organizations, higher returns, lower turnover, and a more attractive workplace to attract the top talent in your field. And then finally, the most important summary that I can share with you today is promoting a diverse and inclusive workforce isn't just the right thing to do, it's more profitable. And there's other slides to show you. It's also what I believe the law requires. So a little bit more in terms of introduction. DEIA practices are not illegal. Again, they're not divisive, as I mentioned earlier. They are compliant with state and federal civil rights laws. That ties back to Chow's presentation in February, that we have civil rights laws to prevent discrimination in our country, and these practices comply with those both state in Minnesota and federal civil rights laws. And particularly in the state, the Minnesota Human Rights Act is a very big piece of the law that makes DEIA practices compliant with that law. They also reduce the risk of, by affirmatively protecting against discriminatory conduct that can violate the law. These policies protect against that. Employees are less likely to be subjected to unlawful discrimination if you have these policies in place. And organizations are less likely to be held liable for discriminatory conduct if they have these policies in place, because they are relying on these policies and treating people appropriately. They're less likely to either have discriminatory conduct or be held liable for what would be, considered more like a bad actor that they're unaware of in their organization. It also improves business performance. So DEI practices prevent discrimination because it includes diverse perspectives in your organization. Not everyone's going to have the same perspective, and that diversity is what not only informs these policies, but also supports and highlights what's unique about your organization and how you can support your employees. This is my favorite bullet point, I think, of this slide, that these practices are important because unlawful conduct, things like sexual harassment, racial discrimination, discrimination based on who we love, that conduct, because of these policies, can be identified, reported, and most importantly to me, addressed. Failing to be proactive about these issues creates a greater risk. And an absence of policies, this is something I learned from this Attorney General document. An absence of these policies is something that a decision maker or authority or the court would consider when determining how to enforce discrimination laws. These policies also follow federal law, and this is, I think, the part that I think a lot of people miss in this understanding the legal landscape, is that the current state of federal law is that preferences based on protected characteristics are generally unlawful. So that's not what we're talking about here. That is something that can no longer occur under our federal law, but this is about enhancing your organization by supporting diversity, by supporting equity, by supporting inclusion, and by supporting accessibility. And finally, next, any executive order cannot prohibit otherwise lawful practices and policies. That's the federal law, that's the state law. An executive order may try to change those things, but under the law, an executive order is not adequate to change federal law or state law. Federal law, it's up to our Congress, potentially interpreted by the Supreme Court at some point. State law, it's up to our state. And I think that that's one thing to, if we need to look at a silver lining, Minnesota law is very strong on these issues, that our leaders in our state are taking these issues seriously. And I believe, thinking about Keith Ellison being part of this guidance, I think we have people in place that recognize how hard this is, how important it is, how critical it is because of the current environment, but they're prepared to lead us through. It's not going to be easy, but I trust that they can do it. These are also best practices because it's about recruiting, hiring, and retaining employees. And I thought this was really interesting. It's about ensuring that no one is overlooked or bypassed because they're a member of a protected class or they have a protected characteristic. We don't want to overlook or bypass those employees in our organizations who are there to do great work. It also provides support for employees so they can develop their skills and contribute to the success of your organization. And again, discrimination laws generally require an employer to pay attention to their practices and how it impacts the groups of people who are um, have protected characteristics, because we want to avoid and limit liability for any potential unlawful conduct. So my view of this, and this was something new to me as well when I prepared this presentation, is that if organizations are doing this properly, they already need to look at these issues to make sure that they're not treating people differently based on a protected characteristic. So why not put these into policies so that everyone knows and everyone's on the same page about how the organization is going to operate? And again, executive orders or actions cannot strip employees or workers of their constitutional rights to speak freely on these issues. So finally, my conclusion for you on this guidance is that companies should continue to implement these initiatives. It's about opening the door for prospective and current employees, no matter their identity or background, to reach their full potential and to ensure the health of all organizations. So thinking about best practices, I appreciate the work that Chow and Wafa do. That I think they're great resources for the next part that I'm going to talk about the best practices and how to implement those in your organization. Those best practices are lawful. They help with legal compliance. They promote the organization's success. They support all the employees, which is critical. And they help remove barriers that unnecessarily limit opportunity for unrepresented groups. I think that's a key thing that perhaps people aren't always thinking about when they're thinking about these issues, particularly in the challenging current climate. So again, organizations should continue to develop these best practices. And the one thing we haven't talked about here is even in assessment and integration. How are you assessing your employees? What are the best practices for that part of your work? All of this is important. And if you're thinking about this topic, even a small step can help move you forward. So again, consult with your legal advisor. Consider an equity audit. I hadn't really thought about this concept before. It's basically taking a really deep dive or deep look at what you're doing currently in terms of supporting your employees, treating everyone with an equitable lens, and including everyone. What are you already doing? And then drafting and discussing action plans. And I would recommend, if your organization is big enough, to include lots of different people in those discussions and action plans. If you have a smaller organization, include who you can. And consider starting with an equity statement. I think that that's where a lot of organizations perhaps start and maybe stop. There's a lot more you can do, but if you haven't started yet, that's perhaps the place to start. And if you're looking for ways to help, consider checking in with each other. Again, this is thinking about that word cloud. It's a very challenging time. It's really hard. But check in with each other in your organization and outside your organization, and support each other like you're all doing today by being here. Reach out to others. You might not even realize how this issue can impact people. You think about your coworker. They might have a neighbor or a family member that is faced with a situation like this, or someone, in their friend group that you might not even realize this is a huge impact on them and the people that they love. And it can be extremely hard to navigate through. but that's why we need to support each other and be intentional about that support. Again, help educate others about their constitutional rights. That the ACLU has really good information on their website about know your rights. I know people that they're called red cards. You print off these red cards, just leave them at a business that perhaps has customers who are from either migrant employees or from our migrant community. Restaurants, stores, it's just a really subtle way to show that you are supportive and that you want them to know their constitutional rights. Knowing your constitutional rights is so critical to this issue, because going back to that family unity issue, it might make a difference between keeping your family together or not. That people have very specific constitutional rights about when they're at their home or when they're in their vehicle or when they're in public, about being subjected to an unreasonable search or seizure, which any questioning would be, and also specific to people's homes and interacting with law enforcement. If there's not a judicial warrant for someone to act the way that they want to, then someone can say, no, I don't want to do that. If it's not a signed judicial warrant signed by a judge, that is the critical piece of information. If that's not present, the people that law enforcement may be interacting with do not need to interact with them. And that Know Your Rights from the ACLU will explain that more thoroughly. And again, focusing on your well-being and those around you. It's just really important to keep the faith here and recognize that these are issues, but there are people working hard to help us get through them. And finally, one of the things I thought about in preparing this presentation is it's really important to normalize accessing services when needed. So that, and this is probably a little bit more about the accessibility portion of DEIA, is that if someone needs extra assistance with accessing services, we want that to be normal for everyone. We don't necessarily want people to be highlighted that someone needs an accommodation or needs to access some sort of services. We want everyone to be able to do that in an equitable way. And one of the ways I found we can do that is we can all get a Rochester municipal ID card. I got mine this week. I was excited to do it. You can do it at the library. It's free. It takes about 15 minutes. And the value of this is it shows that your residence is in the city of Rochester. You live here. It can't be used for driving or purchasing alcohol or tobacco or things like that. It can get you services like lower bus pass fees or the zip rides and that kind of thing. It's fairly new, but the idea here is that if we all have these, it doesn't stand out that someone has these for purposes of identification. You do need to show some documents in order to get it, but once you have it, it serves as your library card and a municipal ID card to access services in the city of Rochester. And I put a QR code. Not only you can get information about how to get the card there, but you can, if you want to, you can also list your business as a business that accepts this card. You'd want to think about and research about how that would interact with your business. But if you're providing services to people in the city of Rochester that people have to show that they live here through like utility bill or driver's license or something like this card might be the adequate identification that people need. And then I just love the fact that we can all be residents of the city of Rochester and promote that. And I doubly love the fact at the bottom of the card it says, I belong here. I think that it's important to highlight we all belong here. And that's why I wanted to tell you about this card. And it just makes my heart sing to see that on this card, that we do all belong here. And that's my kind of my conclusory message for all of you today. Plus the fact that there's other ways that you want to think about helping in this space. You could consider a donation to one of these organizations or reach out to get involved with them. The first one, the logo is a little bit hard to read. It's ACLA. It's the American Chicano Hispanic Latino Association. It's a great resource in here. They put on the Latino Fest every year, which is really, really well attended. They're doing a lot of work in this space. COPAL is a member organization, but doing some great work in organizing our community. I do want to shout out to Southeastern Minnesota Interfaith Immigrant Legal Defense, that this is a great resource that is filling a really important gap. That when our immigrant neighbors, if they are detained by ICE and go into custody, they do not have a right to a public attorney. So you think about, like in our criminal system, if people don't have money for an attorney, one is appointed for them in the criminal process. That does not happen in the immigration process. So this organization was formed to help raise funds to help people who can't afford attorneys hire them, in similar to a public defender in the criminal process. And what I've learned about this is, I want to read the statistics for you, that immigrants who are not detained and have attorneys are 5 times more likely to pursue relief and nearly 5 times more likely to win their cases than people without attorneys. And people who are detained are 11 times more likely to pursue relief if they have an attorney, and twice as likely to obtain relief than people without attorneys. And this one's the shocker, that there are children in this system who are required to represent themselves in this process. So children and other vulnerable populations, you can't even get your head around the fact that they're doing this themselves. There are children having to represent themselves in the immigration system. Having a lawyer is more critical, obviously. And among unaccompanied children with representation, the data shows that 73% are allowed to remain in the United States. That's just amazing, amazing work that people are doing. And Smiled is helping our local community in that space. And again, ACLU of Minnesota, they're the ones with the Know Your Rights information. I would encourage you to reach out if you want to help in that piece of things. So that's what I have for you today. I'm open for any questions.
Thank you so much, Karen. Thank you for the great presentation that's filled with resources. I will make sure to send it afterwards to our group of equity series attendees who received the invites for the series every month. But we're looking forward for any questions, comments in the chat. I know there was a question earlier about, does lawhelpminnesota.org have multilingual resources?
Yes. When you go on the page, the website, it is in English, but at the top left, there's ways to change it to various languages. What's available on there and what's been translated into other languages depends on what you're looking at. I do know for certain that the DOPA form, which is the most critical one for making sure you have plans for your children, that one is definitely in Spanish. I didn't look at the other languages for that, but that's actually new as of January 1st, I think. They got the Spanish version up. It's both the instructions, fact sheet, and the actual form. Again, the form's in English, but there are little subheadings under each line that you need to fill in Spanish, so that you know what to put on that line. And that one needs to be notarized.
And I want to point something out, and I do appreciate you, Karen, talking about how unique Rochester is, because when we think about immigrants, we often think of one form of immigration, but Rochester is definitely unique, as we do have people who migrate here as on workers' visa, working in various jobs that we have. We also have educational institutions that exist here in our community. So we have international students that they come in. So immigration and knowing who is utilizing your organization's services or who works for your organization is really important, so you can be prepared by offering resources for the various immigration statuses. We do have in our community international visitors that they come in seeking medical help. So our community is very unique and very diverse, and immigration shows up in so many different forms. I do appreciate some comments here in the chat about completing an equity audit and discovered great things from Julie from SBDC. That's awesome. Amanda also mentioned just adding in terms of equity audits, there are qualified local folks who administer the IDI and other measurements to check where your staff is with um, DEIA/B. So that is really important. Yes, we do have great consultants, local consultants that they are in Rochester here. I appreciate all the comments, also sharing the websites from the organizations that Karen mentioned in her slides for COPAL or for ACLA. Also the website about the municipal ID from the Rochester Public Library is also available in the chat. But I want to invite people, if you have any questions, you can share them in the chat or open your camera, comment, ask your questions.
Wafa, I did have one more comment about the employers being aware of their employees and what their families may need. Thinking back in a little bit of history to back to 2017 when there were travel bans, that's another consideration, is that if your employees may be traveling out of state, that they may want to consider having these forms just in case, again, it's a crisis emergency situation for their children, to make sure that there's someone to care for them. And I forgot about the downside. If you don't have these plans in place and you're in a crisis like that, your kids could be in a situation where they may need to go in the child protection system if you don't have the safety planning for your children. So that's the downside of not thinking through these very critical safety issues at this time. And it could be temporary, but if there's no one to take your kids and you're not there, that is the response.
Absolutely.
I have a
Go ahead, Al.
maybe a comment that it's good to know that the legal protection for protected group, as you mentioned. But right now, however, it seems like people are debating whether the so-called the other group, the unprotected group, is being discriminated against. So is that the feeling that you also have? There, especially from a federal government standpoint, there's a push to of course eliminate all the DEI kind of low references in federal government websites, etc. And there's also seems like a push to identify that there's discrimination against the other, the so-called unprotected. And the forgetting about the legal precedents of how these affirmative action legal laws came to be, seems like.
Yes, I think you're right about that. I would, my personal opinion is that there's either protected classes or there's not. There's protections based on various characteristics. The rest of the people don't have those legal protections under the law. And so is it overkill to approach things the way you're describing? It might be, or is it a political agenda? Either of those things, I think, are considerations. But my understanding, and this guidance provides further support of this, is that the law protects the protected classes, people outside those protected classes. And just to give a basic overview, the protected classes are race, sex, gender identity in Minnesota, things like that, that if you're not part of that class, I think the way the law views that is that you don't need the protections that the people in the protected class need. And that's with the way the Supreme Court has decided these issues. And that's the current state of the law. So it would require legislative change at the state or the federal level to change that.
The challenge is that there may be a distinction between the legal perspective from the 40% of the American population in general view this issue, right? So the challenge for us is to how do we represent the idea about the human aspect of the need for protection of certain groups of people that have been historically marginalized and have been disadvantaged that's the challenge for all of us, the messaging.
I would agree. I would agree. And I think that that's why it's so important that so many of these attorney generals came out so forcefully about this topic, that they're ready to litigate this from their state perspective. I think that that's why they're creating this document, that they're creating the pathway for what they see as, potentially litigation on this topic. And that's where each state's law is different. And that's why I mentioned that I think it has great laws in this area. And are they at risk of being changed? Possibly, depending on who's in charge. But as things currently stand, we have a lot of protections that other states are kind of the envy of and that they don't have.
Thank you.
Any other comments or questions?
I do have a comment or question, maybe. So lots of folks in this call or this meeting are from organizations, and many organizations might have resources for their teammates and employees. Would it be reasonable, Karen, to say that there should be maybe some thoughtful consideration about what additional documents or what additional resources would be added to that repository that organizations have?
I would turn to you and Wafa in terms of the expertise in what the organization should have. But I always believe that in the legal perspective that sometimes more is necessary. It really depends on the size of the organization and what work they're doing, and how much support there is for initiatives like this. But a lot of times, things like, without an equity statement is critical. But beyond that, I would refer to both of you to make suggestions in that realm, if people should be, number one, looking at them to make sure they're current and updated, number two, determining if there's things to add.
Any final questions from anyone or comments? I'm seeing a lot of resources that's being shared in the chat. Oh,
That's awesome.
and I also see a hand up. Go ahead, Amanda.
Yeah, hi. So one thing I just wanted to share, and I know Karen, you mentioned Minnesota State Human Rights Commission, I think at one point. And so there is a number, if you are not all aware, that if you yourself or any of your staff or employees ever experience any discrimination based on a protected class, there is that 1-800 number that you can call. I believe it's open 24/7. So again, just a resource that we have here in our state that really does help combat some of the negative things that happen, unfortunately, around discrimination against folks with protected statuses. So just wanted to share that quickly. Thank you.
I appreciate that. And I think you might want to look on the county website. When I was on the Human Rights Commission, there was actually a local resource to provide recommendations about that, and that referrals to the Human Rights Commission might be sent down to Rochester to investigate or provide further resources. So if someone calls that number, don't be surprised if you get sent to a more local resource that may have more recommendations for you. But I would agree that the Minnesota Human Rights Commission is the place where any really formal investigation or potential litigation would have a role.
This is great. I know Amanda, Karen shared several upcoming events and resources in our community. Just before concluding our episode, I want to really thank Karen for sharing this presentation with us today. And I want to do a quick check with everyone as you all responded to Karen's question earlier about how you're feeling. If you want to share in the chat, how are you feeling now after the presentation? Hopefully those anxious feelings and defeat, hopefully you're in more positive place by the end of this episode. So go ahead and share your feeling right now in the chat. Thank you so much, Karen, for being with us and for being part
And,
of the Equity Series, Equity Alliance
and
Equity
Wafa,
Series
I would
family.
include that I'm hoping that the additional information and education will at least get people thinking about this and hopefully get to a place where their anxiety level is reduced. And then Wafa, I also realized I didn't put my slide up with my contact information. Can I still do that?
Oh, yes, 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 please do. This is just a quick reminder that our next episode, it's going to be
Okay,
March 9th. But here, I'll stop the share and go ahead and share your final slide, Karen.
there we go. And as important as the beginning is, it's important to continue that dialogue about creating the safe spaces at work. That I think it's a really good way to talk about this topic and it kind of take the political weight out of it and realize that being safe at work is the critical piece here.
Awesome. And look at the chat comments. Some people sharing that they feel a little better because of the legal protections that they exist. Thankful, encouraged. So I think we've done our job. Thank you
Awesome.
so much, Karen. I appreciate you being here. For
You're very welcome. Thank you for having me.
No, thank you. And I guess we'll tap into you again and if we need you to share with us a more legal perspectives on different topics. So thank you so much, everyone, for being with us today. And you have Karen's information here on the screen if you want to reach out to her for more direct questions or looking for more resources. I encourage you to do that. And we will see you all in April for the April episode. Thank you for being with us, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you.